Story 1.
When I first laid eyes on the monolithic structure known as Fort Harrison Penitentiary, my heart plummeted. I had braced myself for the harsh realities of prison life. Unforgiving iron bars, the ceaseless drone of discontent, and the authoritative gaze of those who commanded the halls. Yet the very sight of Fort Harrison, a blend of concrete, brick, and weathered steel, struck a chord deep within me. An unshakable chill wrapped around me as I took in its daunting presence. My name is Alex Carter, the latest addition to the ranks of guards at Fort Harrison. My journey here was not one born out of a long-held desire to uphold the law within the confines of iron walls, but rather a twist of fate. Fort Harrison, with its infamous reputation for housing the most hardened criminals, seemed to be part of another world. Yet nothing could have prepared me for the reality of its grim facade. My first encounter with Warden Jameson was as foreboding as the walls of the prison itself. The man was a figure of discipline, his physique lean and taut, a testament to years of rigorous adherence to a regimented lifestyle. The skin on his face, etched with lines of determination and years of overseeing the unruly elements within these walls, was like a map of his experiences. His eyes were a cold, piercing blue. Standing before him, I couldn't help but feel diminished, a novice about to embark on a journey for which I was ill-prepared. Warden Jameson's briefing was succinct, each word delivered with precision. He outlined my duties with an expectation of compliance that left no room for doubt. The handshake that sealed my initiation was firm, his grip unyielding, further reinforcing the seriousness of the commitment I had just undertaken. Upon my arrival, the other guards introduced themselves with nods or brief handshakes, their expressions guarded. These were men sculpted by the relentless conditions of Fort Harrison Penitentiary, their demeanors as cold as the steel bars they patrolled beside. Unlike the vibrant camaraderie found in other professions, here there was a palpable sense of solemnity, a brotherhood born not of shared joys, but of collective endurance. The prison itself was a labyrinth of corridors and cells, its architecture designed not just to confine, but to intimidate. The walls, a patchwork of concrete and brick, bore the scars of attempts at escape and rebellion. Fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own volition. Each section of the penitentiary had its own eerie character. From the solitary confinement wing, where the silence was suffocating, to the common areas, where the air buzzed with the undercurrents of unspoken tensions. Within the ranks of guards, distinct personalities emerged, each shaped by the relentless demands of Fort Harrison. Michael was known for his humor, a rare commodity in the dim corridors of the prison. It was as straightforward as the meals served in the mess hall. Rodriguez had earned a reputation for his observant nature. Nothing escaped his attention, from the subtle shifts in a prisoner's demeanor to the slightest irregularity during a cell check. Thompson, on the other hand, was the quiet type, his silence not a sign of disinterest, but of deep understanding. He seemed to intuitively grasp the complex dynamics of prison life, navigating his duties with a calm precision. The prisoners, on the other hand, were shadows of the individuals they once were. Their movements were measured, their interactions cautious. This was a stark contrast to my previous post, where the cacophony of voices never ceased. Here the silence was a language of its own, a medium through which fear and resignation flowed freely. Even the most notorious inmates, those whose reputations had preceded them, seemed diminished under the weight of the oppressive atmosphere. Warden David's office was a stark reflection of the man himself, precise, orderly, and unnervingly silent. The desk, A large, imposing piece of dark wood bore nothing but the essentials: a computer, a lamp, and a stack of files, all arranged with geometric precision. The shelves that lined the walls were filled with books that seemed more decorative than read, their spines uncracked and aligned perfectly. The only personal item was a vintage clock, its ticking a constant, almost accusing presence in the room. It was during these late-night walks that I felt a glimpse into the warden's world. The corridors, dimly lit and endlessly long, seemed to transform under his footsteps. I once followed at a distance, my curiosity getting the better of me. He moved with a purpose, stopping before certain cells, laying a hand on the cold stone, and whispering words too low for me to catch. His face, usually so impassive, seemed drawn, the lines deeper, and his brows furrowed in concentration. The guards, for their part, were an enigma of their own. Conversation ceased or switched to mundane topics upon my approach, their smiles tight-lipped and eyes darting away. I noticed their habits, the way they patrolled with hurried steps, avoiding lingering in certain areas, especially the old wing, which was rumored to be closed off for reasons no one would explain. The atmosphere within Fort Harrison grew heavier with each passing day, the air thick with unspoken words and secrets. The prison itself seemed to be a living entity, its mood darkening, the stone walls colder, and the lights dimmer. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of a presence lingering just out of sight. One night, driven by a mix of determination and dread, I decided to confront Warden David. I found him in the old wing, standing before a cell that hadn't housed a prisoner in years. "Warden," I began, my voice firmer than I felt, "why do you walk these halls at night?" He turned, his expression inscrutable, the shadows playing across his face. "Some things," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "are best left undisturbed. Focus on your duties, Carter." In my early weeks, I sought camaraderie with my fellow guards, hoping to find some solace or explanation in shared experiences. Yet my attempts to breach the subject of the prison's unsettling atmosphere were met with nothing but stony silence and fleeting glances. It was as if an unspoken rule hung heavily in the air, a tacit agreement to maintain a facade of indifference. This silent rebuke from my peers only served to deepen my sense of isolation, making the expansive halls of Fort Harrison feel even more constricting. Despite the pervasive atmosphere of unease, my duties remained clear: maintain order and ensure the safety of those within these walls. The prisoners, however, seemed to share in the prison's secret dread. Men, once deemed the most dangerous and unforgiving of criminals, now appeared diminished, their usual bravado replaced by an unsettling quietude. Their fear was palpable, an infectious terror that seemed almost irrational when contrasted with their hardened demeanors. Yet witnessing their trembling hands and anxious glances, I couldn't help but wonder what had instilled such fear in them. This growing tension within the prison's walls did nothing to quell my own anxieties. If anything, it magnified them, each day layering new questions atop old, with no answers in sight. The more I observed, the more I allowed myself to really see, the less I understood. Fort Harrison, with its stoic guards and whispered legends, held secrets that seemed determined to remain unspoken. The day I encountered Big Jim marked a turning point in my tenure at Fort Harrison Penitentiary. Known among the inmates and guards alike for his ruthless behavior and a rap sheet that read like a crime novelist's fever dream, Big Jim was the embodiment of the type of criminal Fort Harrison was built to contain. Yet, as I stood before him, separated by the cold iron bars that had kept him from the world outside for so many years, I saw an unexpected vulnerability. Big Jim's cell was like any other in the high-security wing. Sparse, with peeling paint on the walls and a single narrow window that barely let in light. But as I approached, clipboard in hand, ready to mark off another routine check, Big Jim's demeanor halted me. He was not the imposing figure I had expected, but rather a man visibly shaken, his massive frame hunched, and his eyes darting around the cell before settling on me with an intensity that was almost palpable. "It's watching," he whispered, the words barely escaping his throat. The fear in his voice was unmistakable, a stark contrast to the man whose reputation had preceded him. I paused, unsure how to respond. The air between us grew heavy, charged with an unspoken understanding that whatever was haunting Big Jim was not something that could be easily dismissed or contained. When I arrived here, I expected the usual difficulties associated with guarding dangerous criminals. But there was something inexplicable here. I had to figure out what was going on here. And the more I began to delve into the mysteries of the prison, the more I realized that the real danger was not behind bars. It was in the shadows, lurking in the corners, watching and waiting. The prison itself, with its labyrinthine corridors and shadowed corners, seemed to harbor secrets of its own. As the calendar pages turned, marking my tenure within the stone embrace of Fort Harrison Penitentiary, the unease that had greeted me upon my arrival deepened into a pervasive dread. The prison, with its cold iron bars and echoing corridors, had become a crucible of fear, its atmosphere thick with the tension of impending doom. The first of the deaths was as unexpected as it was gruesome. An inmate, known among his peers for his ruthless efficiency in the prison's underground hierarchy, was found at dawn's light, his lifeless body sprawled across the cold concrete floor of his cell. The scene was one of stark horror, his features frozen in a rictus of terror, eyes wide open and staring into oblivion, his limbs marked with deep, jagged wounds that bore no resemblance to the injuries one might expect in a prison fight. But it was only the beginning. Each morning thereafter seemed to usher in a new horror, another body discovered under similar macabre circumstances. The pattern was unmistakable. Each victim found with those same inexplicable wounds, their final moments marked by an evident terror that spoke of an encounter with something beyond the realm of understanding. The prison doctor, a man who had served Fort Harrison for decades and seen the gamut of human cruelty, was at a loss. His examinations revealed little beyond the obvious. The wounds were not made by any weapon he could identify, and there were no signs of a struggle, as if the victims had faced their end in a state of paralysis, overwhelmed by fear. As the death toll rose, so too did the fear among the inmates. The bravest among them, men who had faced down life sentences without flinching, were now seen huddled in their cells, whispering fervent prayers into the darkness. The prison's own rules and hierarchies seemed to crumble under the weight of this shared terror, alliances forgotten in the face of an enemy that could not be seen, fought, or understood. I found myself caught between my duties as a guard and the growing realization that Fort Harrison harbored a darkness far deeper than the crimes of its inmates. My rounds, once routine, had become a gauntlet of whispered pleas for protection and glimpses of fear-stricken faces peering out from behind steel doors. In the thick of my investigation into the unexplained deaths at Fort Harrison, my days became a blur of whispered confessions and covert glances. The prisoners, each ensnared by their own fears, began to open up about the horrors they believed lurked in the shadows. Their tales, steeped in the superstition of men grappling with the unknown, painted a picture of a prison haunted not by the misdeeds of its inhabitants, but by something far older and more malevolent. "These walls don't just hold the living," one inmate confided, his voice a low hiss as if afraid of being overheard by unseen ears. "They're a veil, thin and tearing between us and what waits on the other side. Each story shared a common thread. Apparitions that defied explanation, dark figures seen from the corner of an eye, and an oppressive feeling of being watched. The more I listened, the more a chilling pattern emerged, weaving through the fabric of Fort Harrison's history like a dark stain. My inquiries, however, did not go unnoticed. The other guards were now watching me with a mixture of suspicion and caution. Their sidelong glances and the abrupt end to conversations when I approached spoke volumes of their wariness. It was clear that my quest for answers was stepping on sensitive ground, disturbing a status quo that had long governed the silent compacts within the prison's walls. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. I've been going through prison records looking for some clue that might explain what's going on here. The other guards now avoided me outright, their fear of what I might uncover perhaps greater than their fear of the prison's unseen resident. My investigation took on a new urgency, driven by the knowledge that whatever dwelled within Fort Harrison was not only real but potentially dangerous. The deaths, the apparitions, the pervasive sense of dread, all pointed to a phenomenon that defied logical explanation. On an unusually quiet night at Fort Harrison Penitentiary, the silence was almost a physical entity, oppressive and foreboding. I was alone on night duty, navigating the maze of corridors with only the echo of my footsteps for company. The stillness was unsettling, a stark contrast to the daytime cacophony of clanging doors and shouted conversations. As I rounded a corner, my sense of unease crystallized into raw fear. There, at the far end of the corridor, illuminated by the feeble glow of the overhead lights, stood a figure. Its height was remarkable, towering over any inmate or staff member I had ever encountered. The silhouette hinted at a masculine form, but it was distorted, unnaturally bulky with a pronounced hump that spoke of something otherworldly. The figure was clad in the familiar garb of a prison guard, a dark uniform that should have been reassuring. Yet there was nothing comforting about this apparition. It stood motionless, a sentinel in the dim light, and as my eyes struggled to make sense of what I was seeing, a low growl emanated from its direction, a sound so deep it seemed to resonate within the very walls of Fort Harrison. My heart raced, thudding loudly in the silence, and for a moment I was paralyzed, caught in the primal fear of prey under the predator's gaze. The creature's head tilted slightly, as if curious, and the growl intensified, a clear warning that was felt more than heard. Instincts I hadn't known I possessed surged to the forefront, propelling me to action. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing down the corridor as I fled the inexplicable horror behind me. The growl followed, a haunting sound that seemed to chase me through the twisting hallways of the prison. As I ran, the rational part of my mind grappled with what I had just witnessed. Questions spiraled through my thoughts with no logical answers to anchor them. Was it a trick of the light? A figment of my overwrought imagination? The chilling encounter with the creature, its towering form etched into my memory, left me trembling, my breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. I pressed myself into a recessed shadow, an attempt to merge with the stone and become invisible to whatever horrors roamed the halls. The creature's footsteps, heavy and foreboding, echoed through the corridors, a harbinger of dread that faded into the distance until all was silent once more. Yet, the silence brought no solace, only a deepening fear. Time lost meaning as I remained hidden, my heart racing in a futile bid for escape from my ribcage. When I finally dared to venture from my makeshift sanctuary, the oppressive atmosphere of the prison greeted me, a tangible cloak of terror that seemed to settle more heavily upon my shoulders than before. It was a stark realization. a moment of clarity in the midst of chaos. Fort Harrison was no mere prison but a hunting ground, and we, its inhabitants, were unwitting prey caught in a game we did not understand. The change in me did not go unnoticed. The other guards, men with whom I had shared countless shifts and mundane conversations, now regarded me with a mixture of suspicion and fear. Their glances, once indifferent or companionable, were now laden with wariness. They whispered among themselves, their words ceasing abruptly as I approached, leaving an unspoken tension hanging in the air. I could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the unasked questions that lingered in their eyes. What had I seen? What did I know? Nights became an ordeal, each shift a test of endurance. The once familiar sound of creaking floorboards or the soft whistle of the wind through the barred windows now carried ominous undertones. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and fraught with nightmares that mirrored the darkness of the prison's corridors. My waking hours were no less torturous, a ceaseless vigil against unseen threats that lurked in every shadow, every unwatched corner. The corridors I had once navigated with ease now seemed alien, transformed into a maze designed to disorient and terrify. The days were filled with a growing paranoia, an unshakable feeling of being watched. The prisoners, too, seemed to sense the shift within me, their gazes heavy with unspoken questions and fears of their own. Conversations were terse, punctuated by glances over shoulders and a palpable tension that permeated the very air. It was as if my encounter had marked me, set me apart not just from my fellow guards but from everyone within the prison's walls. As the weeks passed, the barrier between my professional facade and the terror that gnawed at my insides grew thinner. I found myself jumping at the slightest sound, a perpetual cold sweat clinging to my skin. My interactions with others became strained, my responses clipped, as I fought to maintain a semblance of normalcy in a situation that was anything but. My days were filled with paranoia. Each pair of eyes that met mine carried a silent question. Was it too much I knew? The corridors of Fort Harrison Penitentiary seemed longer as I made my way to Warden David's office, each step weighted with the burden of my mission. Reaching the door marked Warden, I paused, taking a moment to gather my thoughts and steady my resolve. The truth of my identity and my findings within these walls were a volatile mix, one that could either unlock the answers I sought or seal my fate within this place of shadows. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open, stepping into a room that mirrored the man who occupied it. Warden David, a man whose reputation for sternness and control preceded him, sat behind his desk, the embodiment of authority within the prison's hierarchy. His eyes, sharp and assessing, met mine as I entered, a silent challenge in their depths. It was a look I had seen many times before, but today it held a different weight. Today, I was not just a guard under his command, but a bearer of truths that could unravel the carefully maintained order of Fort Harrison. Gathering my courage, I broke the silence, my voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Warden David," I began, "there's something you need to know." The words flowed, a torrent of confessions and revelations that I could no longer contain. I spoke of my true identity as a police officer sent undercover to investigate the dark occurrences within the prison, of the deaths that defied explanation, and of the creature that lurked in the shadows, a presence both terrifying and unexplainable. Warden David listened, his expression unreadable, as I laid bare the fears and suspicions that had plagued me since my arrival. The monstrous apparition, the whispers of ancient evils bound within the stone walls, the inexplicable dread that had taken hold of both guards and inmates alike. It was all laid out before him, a puzzle that only he might have the pieces to complete. As my tale came to an end, a heavy silence fell between us. The warden's face, usually so impassive, betrayed a flicker of something unidentifiable. Was it recognition? Fear? The moment stretched, a chasm of uncertainty that threatened to swallow me whole. In the moments following my revelation to Warden David, time seemed to stand still. The silence in the office, a suffocating blanket that wrapped itself around me. His reaction, however, was not the one I had anticipated. The slow spread of his smile, a chilling display of amusement and malice, signaled a turn in events that I was wholly unprepared for. "Is that so?" His voice, a low drawl, was laced with a tone that sent a shiver down my spine. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut, the finality of a door closing on the last sliver of hope. The warden's next actions were swift, a choreographed response that spoke of premeditation. With a casual stride, he moved to the door, opening it with a flourish to summon the guards stationed outside. Their entrance was a silent storm, a coordinated movement of bodies trained to respond to the warden's unspoken commands. Their expressions, a disturbing echo of David's own unsettling smile, offered no comfort, no hint of hesitation as they advanced. The realization of my predicament crystallized in that moment, the walls of the office closing in as I found myself the focus of their predatory attention. Before I could muster a response, a protest or plea for understanding, their hands were upon me, their grip unyielding. The betrayal stung, a sharp contrast to the camaraderie I had once shared with these men. Dragged from the room, my attempts to reason, to explain, were lost in the chaos of the moment, unheard or simply ignored. The journey through the corridors of Fort Harrison was a blur, the familiar paths now a labyrinth leading to my own imprisonment. The stares of inmates and guards alike bore into me, a mixture of confusion and curiosity that went unanswered as I was propelled forward. Thrown into a cell, the cold embrace of the concrete floor was a harsh welcome. The sound of the door slamming shut, the finality of the lock clicking into place, echoed in the cramped space, a grim punctuation to the rapid change in my circumstances. In the span of moments, I had transitioned from investigator to inmate, a player in the twisted game that Fort Harrison seemed to thrive on. The cell, a stark, barren space that offered no comfort, became my new reality. Its walls, cold and unyielding, were not just a physical barrier but a symbolic one, marking the line between the freedom I had taken for granted and the confinement that was now my lot. As I settled into the reality of my confinement, I knew that the coming days would test me in ways I had yet to imagine. Trapped within the stark confines of Fort Harrison Penitentiary, each day became a battle for sanity, a test of endurance. The cell that held me was both sanctuary and prison, a place of relative safety that also served as a constant reminder of my powerless state. The creature that stalked the corridors of Fort Harrison was an ever-present threat, a shadowy predator that haunted my thoughts and fueled my nightmares. I found myself cataloging the hours by the sounds that penetrated my cell, the distant clanging of doors, the muffled footsteps of guards on their rounds, and most unnervingly, the periodic growls of the creature that lurked unseen. These sounds were the soundtrack to my confinement, a relentless reminder of the horror that lay just beyond the reach of sight. At night, the prison transformed. The absence of daylight did nothing to stifle the presence of the creature. If anything, it seemed to embolden it. The growls grew louder, closer, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. The screams of the prisoners, those unfortunate enough to encounter the beast, pierced the heavy silence, each one a stark testament to the deadly game of predator and prey played out in the darkness. The question of the creature's existence, its origins and purpose within the walls of Fort Harrison consumed me. Why did Warden David protect it? What pact had been made that allowed such a monster to roam free? These questions circled endlessly in my mind, a maze with no exit in sight. Days melded into each other in the dim confines of my cell, marked only by the scant light that crept through the small, barred window. The monotony of confinement was a torment of its own, each moment stretching into eternity, punctuated only by the distant echoes of footsteps and the occasional distant scream that shattered the oppressive silence of Fort Harrison Penitentiary. Fear was a constant companion, an ever-present shadow that loomed larger with each passing day. It was not just the fear of the unseen creature that stalked the prison corridors or the inexplicable events that had led to my wrongful imprisonment. It was the fear of the unknown, of what fate awaited me within these walls that seemed to close in a little more with each passing moment. Hunger gnawed at me, both physical and mental. The meager rations that were pushed through the slot in the door did little to sate the emptiness that had taken root in my stomach. But it was the hunger for answers, for some shred of understanding in the midst of this nightmare, that was truly insatiable. Isolation was its own form of torture. The silence of the cell was a heavy, tangible thing, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the occasional muffled noises that filtered in from the outside. I longed for human contact, for a voice that wasn't my own echoing off the cold stone walls. When the day came that I was finally let out into the courtyard, the sensation was surreal. The open sky above me was a stark contrast to the oppressive gloom of my cell. Despite the chill in the air, there was a momentary surge of relief, a fleeting sense of freedom that came with being outside the confines of my cell. The courtyard was a bleak expanse of concrete, surrounded by the towering walls of the prison. Other prisoners milled about, shadows of men worn down by the rigors of their confinement. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollow, each one a testament to the harsh reality of life within Fort Harrison. In my desperation for answers, I approached them, seeking any fragment of information that might shed light on the situation. Their reactions were a mix of fear and resignation, a silent communication that spoke volumes of the horrors they had endured. The truth of their silence was more horrifying than I could have imagined. The sight of their mutilated tongues was a shock, a visceral reminder of the price of speaking out within these walls. It was a brutal enforcement of the prison's code of silence, a rule that was maintained at a horrifying cost. The realization that these men had been so cruelly silenced was a turning point. The horror of their mutilation, the depth of the cruelty it represented, was a stark revelation of the lengths to which the administration would go to maintain their secrets. My time in the courtyard, brief as it was, became a moment of profound clarity. The faces of the other prisoners, marked by suffering and fear, were a mirror reflecting the grim reality of Fort Harrison. It was a place where humanity was stripped away, where unspeakable horrors were hidden behind a facade of routine and silence. Back in the confines of my cell, the cold, hard floor became a stark reminder of my own helplessness. The chilling air of the night brushed against my skin as the heavy door to my cell creaked open, an ominous sound that signaled the beginning of an unforeseen horror. Warden David, flanked by a cadre of guards, stood at the threshold, his presence a dark omen. The usual sternness of his demeanor was replaced with a disturbing smile, one that did not reach the cold depths of his eyes. "We're going for a walk," he announced, his voice devoid of the customary authority, instead imbued with an unsettling cheer. The chains that bound my wrists felt heavier than ever as I was escorted out of the cell, a silent procession through the dimly lit corridors of Fort Harrison Penitentiary. The night air hit me with a biting chill as we stepped into the open yard, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the interior. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the prison, transforming the familiar yard into a scene from a nightmare. The sense of foreboding deepened as Warden David stopped, surveying the assembled prisoners with a gaze that seemed to pierce through the darkness. "The table is set," he declared, his voice echoing off the stone walls, filling the space with a sense of dread. The ambiguity of his words did nothing to quell the growing fear among us, a collective apprehension that tightened its grip with each passing moment. Without warning, the transformation began. It was a spectacle that defied logic, a grotesque display of nature twisted. The guards, men I had known, whose faces were as familiar as the cell I occupied, began to contort and shift before our very eyes. Their bodies elongated, muscles bulging and bones cracking in a horrific symphony of metamorphosis. Within moments, the human forms gave way to monstrous silhouettes, creatures of nightmare that stood on two legs, their features wolf-like and ferocious. The growls that erupted from their throats were primal, a sound that resonated with the most basic instinct of fear. The warden, the orchestrator of this nightmarish tableau, stood unchanged, his smile widening as he watched the transformation unfold, a malevolent spectator to the carnage that was about to commence. Paralyzed by terror, I could only watch as the creatures advanced on the prisoners. The screams that filled the night were a testament to the horror that unfolded under the cold gaze of the moon. One by one, the prisoners fell, their cries cut short by the merciless onslaught of the beasts that had once been their guards. The yard, a place that had once represented a brief respite from the confines of the cell, had become a hunting ground, the stage for a gruesome feast. The creatures moved with terrifying efficiency, their forms bathed in moonlight as they tore through flesh and bone. The morning after the night's unspeakable events, Fort Harrison Penitentiary resumed its deceptive guise of order and control. The sun's rays, breaking over the prison's high walls, cast long shadows that seemed to mock the darkness that had enveloped the yard just hours before. As Warden David, I observed the aftermath from the confines of my office, the room a silent testament to the duality of my existence within these walls. The cleanup had been swift, the bodies of the fallen prisoners removed with a cold, detached efficiency. It was a routine perfected over time, a grim choreography that the guards executed with practiced indifference. The yard, now empty, bore no trace of the horror that had transpired, the ground scrubbed clean of the evidence of our nocturnal activities. In the days that followed, a heavy silence settled over Fort Harrison, a palpable sense of fear that permeated the stone and steel. The prisoners, those who had survived the night, were visibly changed. They huddled in their cells, their conversations mere whispers, their eyes wide and haunted by what they had witnessed. It was a silence born of terror, a mute testament to the power I wielded over them. The guards, my loyal pack, patrolled the corridors with a newfound sense of purpose. Their smiles, thin and cold, were a reminder to all of the consequences of defiance. They moved with the confidence of those who had embraced their true nature, their transformation from man to beast, now an open secret among the prison population. My position as warden of Fort Harrison, a role I had once assumed with a sense of duty, had evolved. The prison, in my eyes, was a masterpiece of control, a domain where the line between man and monster blurred. The punishment system I had perfected was not just effective. It was a work of art, a delicate balance of fear, obedience, and the occasional unleashing of primal instincts. As I sat in my office, the walls adorned with the reminders of my authority, I contemplated the events of the previous night with a sense of satisfaction. The transformation, the hunt, the feast, it was all necessary, a demonstration of power that reinforced the hierarchy within Fort Harrison. Picking up the phone, I dialed the number of the main office, the routine report ready on my lips. The story of a riot, a fabrication designed to explain away the loss of life, was a narrative I had employed before. It was believable, a scenario that fit neatly into the expectations of those who sought to question the happenings within the prison's walls. "There's been a riot at the prison," I began, my voice calm, detached from the gravity of the lie I was about to tell. "Fortunately, it has been dealt with, but unfortunately, we have casualties." The words were a rehearsed script, a veil of deceit that masked the true nature of our nocturnal activities. The mention of Alex Carter, a name now tied to a tale of tragic loss, was the final stroke of the brush on the canvas of lies I had painted. "A young guard named Alex Carter was killed during the confrontation," I reported. A statement that would no doubt elicit sympathy and perhaps even admiration for the way the situation had been handled. The call was a necessary step, a move in the intricate game of shadows and lies that I played. It was a declaration of my control, not just over Fort Harrison, but over the narrative that surrounded it. The prison, my kingdom, was a place where horrors lurked in the shadows, where the line between man and monster was erased, and where I, Warden David, ruled with an iron fist cloaked in velvet. As I hung up the phone, the silence of the office enveloped me once more. Fort Harrison Penitentiary, with its cold, unforgiving walls and its inhabitants, both human and otherwise, was a reflection of the world as I saw it, a place where power was the only currency of value, and where survival depended on the recognition of the beasts that dwelled within us all.
Story 2. I leaned back in the worn-out leather chair, the polished badge on my chest reflecting the stark fluorescent light of my office. As the warden of the newest prison in the state, the job was a point of pride for me. My name is Jack, and this prison, this concrete giant, was supposed to be my legacy. This prison was my design, my brainchild. State-of-the-art security systems, electronically locked cells that could stand up to the most determined inmates, and surveillance cameras that left no corner unwatched. We even had drone patrols on the perimeter. Every detail was meticulously crafted, every loophole thoroughly examined. It was an impenetrable fortress, a testament to modern technology and architecture. 3 months since we'd opened the doors, 3 months since the first batch of prisoners had stepped onto the cold, pristine tiles, and things had started to shift. It began subtly. Cells would power down for no discernible reason, leaving guards scrambling to manually lock them down. Surveillance feeds would go static, only to return to normal with no evidence of tampering. My IT guys were pulling their hair out, unable to find any bugs in the system. Then, the rumors started among the guards. They spoke in hushed whispers about strange odors permeating the prison, like sulfur and rotting meat. They complained about unsettling noises during the graveyard shift, a chorus of low growls and scuttling sounds that echoed through the empty corridors. I dismissed these as mere figments of overactive imaginations, fueled by the late-night ghost stories some of the older guards liked to share. But then the inmates started talking. Hardened men, criminals who had seen the worst humanity had to offer, began murmuring about something in the dark. They talked about small, shadowy figures that skulked around their cells. Days passed, and the strange occurrences continued. The random system failures, the odd smells, the eerie sounds. The prison felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, an unseen tension hanging in the air. The guards started taking leaves, some even quit without notice. The inmates grew more restless, their sleep plagued by nightmares. The prison, once my monument of order and control, was slowly turning into a house of fear and mystery. The worst part was, I felt powerless, unable to quell the rising tide of panic. In the lunchroom, I overheard more stories from the inmates. Tales of shadowy figures that moved with an inhuman speed, whispers that filled their ears with unspeakable horrors, and the smell of decay that seemed to seep from the walls. One day, on my rounds, I found the cell of one of the most dangerous criminals empty. The bed was neatly made, personal belongings stacked in a corner. There was no note, no explanation. The prisoner had simply disappeared. The prison was quiet that day, the deafening silence drowning out the familiar clanking of metal doors and distant conversations. I retired to my office, an uneasy feeling gnawing at me. Prison, my prison, was no longer a symbol of justice or order. It was now turning into a place of incomprehensible horror. And I, her warden, was forced to wrestle with the fear and uncertainty that hung over her like a shroud. As the day drew to a close, I found myself standing at the edge of the prison yard, staring up at the high concrete walls. They seemed to loom over me, casting long, dark shadows that stretched across the ground like skeletal fingers. Days turned into weeks, each one blending into the next in a monotonous, eerie rhythm. The strange occurrences in the prison became our new normal. The fear, once a disquieting undercurrent, now surged like a tidal wave, enveloping us all in its icy grip. The inmates, men who had once stood tall and defiant, were breaking. I could see it in their eyes, a vacant look that spoke of a terror I couldn't fathom. Some would cower in the corners of their cells, their bodies shaking with an inexplicable fear. Food trays were returned untouched, the inmates' appetites stolen by the dread that permeated the prison. Some took to self-harm, their bodies becoming canvases of their torment. Deep gashes and burn marks littered their skin, a gruesome testament to their desperate attempts to drown out the fear. Suicide attempts became a grim routine, with guards on constant vigil to thwart their desperate attempts at escape. And then, the disappearances started. Guards, especially those on night duty, would vanish without a trace. Their lockers would remain untouched, their uniforms neatly folded. They left behind confused families and an atmosphere of dread that hung over the prison like a death shroud. Days later, they would be found. Some were dead, their bodies showing signs of severe trauma, their faces frozen in an eternal expression of terror. Those who were found alive were no better off. They were catatonic, their eyes vacant, their minds seemingly lost it. The prison was crumbling, not in its physical form, but in its very essence. The fear was not just in the minds of the inmates and guards, it had seeped into the walls, the floors, the air. My nights were restless, filled with nightmares of shadowy figures and disquieting whispers. Sleep, once a refuge, had become a battleground, my dreams a mirror to the horrors unfolding in the prison. One night, as I tossed and turned in my bed, I woke up to a chilling sight. A small, shadowy figure stood by the foot of my bed, its face obscured by the darkness. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and it stared at me, its gaze penetrating the veil of fear and sleep. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, staring, its presence an embodiment of the prison's unseen terror. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving behind an eerie silence that echoed my pounding heart. That encounter marked a turning point. The prison was not just a breeding ground for fear and horror. It was now a portal to the unknown, a bridge between our world and something far more sinister. Days turned into a blur, the fear a constant companion. My once bustling office was now a solitary haven, the steady hum of the surveillance monitors a haunting lullaby. Every flicker of the screen, every static buzz, sent chills down my spine, amplifying the feeling of impending doom. As I surveyed the prison through the grainy footage, I felt a deep sense of despair. The men I was responsible for, both guards and inmates alike, were falling apart. Their hollow eyes, their gaunt faces, their trembling hands, all telling a story of a fear that gnawed at their sanity. I tried to keep up the semblance of order, arranging counseling sessions for the inmates, bringing in psychologists and spiritual leaders, but it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a bucket. One night, I found myself in the control room, staring at a wall of monitors displaying the static-filled images of the prison. A sudden movement caught my eye. On one of the screens, I saw a guard making his rounds. It was Thompson, one of the few who hadn't left or disappeared. He was a brave man, a former Marine who held onto his duty like a lifeline amidst the chaos. As I watched him patrol the empty corridor, I noticed something. Small, shadowy figures skulking behind him, their glowing eyes visible even through the grainy footage. I watched in horror as they closed in on him, their forms merging with the shadows. I found myself on my feet, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted down the hallway. I arrived at the corridor just in time to see Thompson turn around, his face going white as he stared at the empty space behind him. He collapsed, his body convulsing as he clutched his chest. I ran to him, my mind racing as I called for help over the radio. But I knew it was too late. The life faded from his eyes as he stared past me, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. His final words, a hoarse whisper that chilled me to the bone. "They're here." In the end, it all came down to the fact that the police came to us. They had to find out the cause of a series of unexplained tragedies. The arrival of the police was a mere formality, a nod to the semblance of order in the face of an unknowable terror. They roamed the hollow corridors, their faces masked by a thin veneer of professionalism, barely concealing the undercurrent of dread. The investigations were thorough, a maze of questioning, evidence gathering, and futile attempts to piece together the puzzle. But the prison was an enigma that defied logic, a monument to the inexplicable and the unseen. The remaining guards went about their duties with an air of resignation, their faces mirroring the hopelessness that had become our shared reality. 5 days into the investigation, something changed. As I walked down the all-too-familiar corridor, a sudden chill crept up my spine. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest as I felt a presence, an otherworldly sensation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Turning around, I was met with a sight that will haunt me till my dying day. There they were, the shadowy figures not confined to the corners of my eye but standing right before me. They were small, like children, their faces twisted into expressions of rage and terror. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. The figures advanced, their forms flickering like a mirage, their whispers growing louder. I turned and ran, the horrifying apparitions hot on my heels. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted down the hallway, my breaths coming in short gasps. Just as I felt my strength waning, I made it to the control room. Slamming the door behind me, I collapsed against it, my body shaking from the adrenaline and fear. I was safe for now. But the reprieve was short-lived. A sudden heat gripped the room, and a bright orange glow illuminated the corridor outside. Flames erupted from the bowels of the prison, consuming everything in its path. The prison was burning. I didn't have a moment to waste. Grabbing the radio, I sounded the alarm, instructing everyone to evacuate immediately. The flames spread quickly, the heat turning the concrete walls into a furnace. The prison was ablaze, the once imposing structure reduced to a fiery skeleton. But we had made it out, a small victory amidst the overwhelming loss. The police cordoned off the area, their faces reflecting the shock and awe of the unfolding spectacle. Despite the best efforts of the investigators, no explanation was found for the series of tragic and mysterious events. The prison was closed, its remnants a grim reminder of the horror that had unfolded within its walls.
Story 3.
I could feel the weight of the past as we approached the imposing edifice. The prison, long abandoned, squatted in the twilight like a brooding monolith, its silence only surpassed by the centuries-old secrets it guarded. It was a place where laughter had died, replaced by a mournful symphony of iron bars clashing and cries echoing in the wind. I shivered, not from the cool evening breeze but from a sense of foreboding, a premonition of the strange mysteries that awaited us. "Are you all right, Jake?" Meredith, our group's self-proclaimed spiritual guide, asked, her hazel eyes studying me with an unsettling intensity. "Just thinking about the place," I replied, my voice barely a whisper, my gaze unflinchingly fixed on the prison's austere facade. "It's more than just a building, you know. It's a tomb of stories. Each brick, each stone, is drenched in tales of despair and sorrow," she intoned, her voice lending an eerie cadence to the hush of the evening. Her words hung in the air like an ominous prophecy, making me more aware of the daunting task ahead. We were not just amateur paranormal enthusiasts. We were storytellers, ready to narrate a tale that had been muted by the walls of this prison. Our team was an eclectic mix: Meredith, the spiritual guide, Paul, the tech wizard, and me, Jake, the aspiring writer who believed that every story deserved to be told, no matter how unsettling. Paul was busy fiddling with his equipment, an array of devices designed to sense the slightest hint of paranormal activity. "We're all set," he announced, his voice barely concealing the excitement. As we crossed the threshold, the chilling air wrapped around us like a shroud. The echo of our footsteps seemed to breathe life into the long-forgotten tales of the prison. The decrepit walls, stained with age, wore an eerie silence, as if they were waiting for the right moment to unfold their narrative. Paul, ever the pragmatist, was the first to break the silence. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts here. Something is definitely up," he stated, his eyes never leaving the device in his hand. Meredith nodded. "I can feel a strong energy presence. There is a heaviness that is overpowering." I could feel it too. A strange pressure that seemed to push against us. A silent resistance from the ghostly inhabitants of the prison. It was as if the air was thick with the untold stories of the past, hanging in the balance between the world of the living and the dead. We decided to explore the cell block first, a long, dim corridor lined with decrepit cells. Each cell held a tale of its own, the rusted iron bars a testament to the lives that had been confined within. The silence was punctuated only by our own soft footsteps and the occasional creak of the prison settling into its nightly slumber. As I stood in front of one cell, an inexplicable sense of dread washed over me. It was as if I could feel the despair of the inmate who had once occupied the space. The worn-out cot, the barren walls, and the small window that offered but a glimpse of the outside world were stark reminders of a life spent in isolation. "I can sense a strong presence here," Meredith said, her voice a hushed whisper as she stood beside me, her eyes closed in concentration. As the words left her mouth, Paul's device began to beep wildly. "Guys, we've got something here," he said, his voice echoing down the corridor. His eyes, wide with anticipation, were glued to the screen of his device. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, as if time itself was bending under the weight of the untold stories. I felt an unseen presence, a whisper of the past that still lingered within the stone-cold walls. Meredith shivered and pulled her coat tighter around her. "There's a sadness here," she murmured. "A despair that's been imprinted on these walls." I could feel it too, a palpable sorrow that hung heavy in the air. I thought about the countless souls that had been confined within these walls, the stories of their lives etched into the very fabric of the building. The chilling reality of their existence seemed to seep into my bones, filling me with a sense of dread that was as real as the cold stone beneath my feet. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed through the corridor. It was a soft, melancholic hum, barely audible yet undeniably present. We froze, our breath hitching in our throats. Paul's device began to beep wildly, the frantic rhythm matching the pounding of my heart. The hum grew louder, filling the corridor with a haunting melody that was as beautiful as it was chilling. It was a song of despair, a lament of lost freedom. The song reverberated around us, its melody weaving a chilling tale of sorrow and despair. We stood there transfixed as the haunting melody washed over us, touching the deepest corners of our souls. It was as if the prison was finally ready to share its secrets, its walls breaking their centuries-long silence. "Did you hear that?" Paul finally broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at us, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. "We heard it," I replied, my voice barely audible. The haunting melody still echoed in my mind, its chilling notes a stark reminder of the dark secrets that the prison held. We moved deeper into the building, the only light coming from Paul's handheld device and the glow of our flashlights dancing on the decaying walls. The eerie song from before hung over us like a specter, our ears straining for any trace of the haunting melody. Yet, the prison remained silent, its narrative suspended in the cold air. As we ventured further into the labyrinth, Meredith's expression turned graver. "The energy is stronger here," she muttered, her hand fluttering over her heart. "It's almost overwhelming." Paul looked at his device, then at Meredith. "The readings corroborate what you're saying," he said, his voice holding an edge of apprehension that I had never heard before. I watched them, my mind teetering between skepticism and belief. The eerie atmosphere, the chilling melody, the inexplicable cold spots. It was hard to dismiss it all as mere coincidence. The prison was seeping into us, its history, its dread, its despair. We found ourselves standing in front of the solitary confinement cells, the most dreaded section of the prison. The air was markedly colder here, the silence more oppressive. The barred doors hung open, revealing the darkness within. Entering the first cell, I felt the space close in around me. The walls seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, the echoes of past suffering reverberating through the air. I imagined a prisoner, trapped within these four walls, his pleas for mercy drowned by the stone-cold silence. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the cell, causing me to shudder. I heard Meredith gasp, and I turned to see her standing at the doorway, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The despair, the agony." I nodded, unable to find my voice. I could feel it too, the remnants of fear and despair etched into the very essence of the cell. Paul, who had been quiet, suddenly let out a low whistle. "Guys, you need to see this," he said, his device pointed at the far wall. A faint outline glowed on the screen, an outline that bore an uncanny resemblance to a human figure. My heart hammered in my chest as I looked from the screen to the empty cell. There was nothing there, yet Paul's device indicated otherwise. We have a presence," Paul stammered, his normally calm demeanor replaced by nervous excitement. Meredith took a step back, her face pale. "I can feel it too," she said, her voice trembling. "It S ... IT S so strong." For a moment we stood in silence, a sense of awe and dread filling the cell. We were not alone. The prison was alive, its inhabitants unseen but undeniably present. The sudden realization sent a chill down my spine. The prison was not just a building, it was a living entity, a container for the souls who had been wronged, their cries for justice echoing through the ages. A faint whisper broke the silence. a chilling reminder of the presence that lurked in the shadows. The whisper grew louder, filling the cell with a melancholic symphony that echoed the despair etched into the prison walls. The further we ventured, the stronger the feelings became. Despair, sorrow, anger, fear. It was as if we were walking through a gallery of human emotions, each cell a canvas painted with the shades of human suffering. Suddenly, Meredith halted, her hand flying to her chest. "Something's not right," she murmured, her eyes darting around nervously. Paul and I exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice echoing in the hollow corridor. She swallowed hard, her face pale. There's something else here," she said, her voice trembling. "Something dark." A chill ran down my spine at her words. The prison was already a hub of despair and suffering. What could possibly be darker than that? Paul's device began to beep wildly, the red lights flashing ominously. "She's right," he said, his voice strained. "The readings are off the charts. There's something else here with us." Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the corridor, the chilling touch sending shivers down my spine. The air seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, a dark presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We stood there, frozen in our tracks, as the prison echoed with a haunting melody. It was the same song from before, but this time it held a darker tone. It was a lament, a plea for mercy from the depths of despair. As the song faded, we were left standing in the oppressive silence, the echo of the haunting melody hanging in the air. "We need to tread carefully," Meredith said, her voice barely a whisper. "There's more to this place than we imagined." I nodded, my mind racing with the horrifying possibilities. We descended further into the heart of the prison, the darkness swallowing us whole. The air was thicker here, laden with a despair so palpable that it was almost suffocating. The walls, drenched in centuries-old secrets, seemed to breathe along with us, their cold stone surfaces pulsing with an unseen energy. Meredith was visibly shaken, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a nervous tension that made her movements jerky. Paul, on the other hand, was a picture of concentration, his gaze fixed on his device, his fingers dancing over the buttons as he attempted to decipher the unseen presence around us. The eerie silence was broken by the occasional beep from Paul's device, each one a chilling reminder of the invisible inhabitants of the prison. As we moved further into the labyrinth, the beeps grew more frequent, the unseen presence growing stronger. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the corridor, causing us to jump in alarm. It sounded like a door slamming shut, its echo reverberating through the stone walls. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Paul nodded, his face pale. "It came from that direction," he said, pointing towards a dimly lit corridor. With bated breath, we made our way towards the sound. The corridor led us to a large iron door. It was closed, its cold, rusty surface emanating an aura of dread. "This is it," Meredith murmured, her voice trembling. "This is where the dark energy is strongest." Paul's device was beeping wildly, the red lights flashing ominously. "She's right," he said, his voice strained. "There's definitely something in there." With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. A chill ran down my spine as we stepped into the room. It was a large, open space, the air heavy with the scent of decay. The room was unlike any other we had encountered so far. The walls were lined with chains, their rusty surfaces a stark reminder of the torture that had taken place within these four walls. A large wooden table stood in the middle of the room, its surface stained with dried blood. The room was a living nightmare, a testament to the horrors that had been inflicted upon the prisoners. The chains rattled softly, the eerie sound echoing through the room. It was as if the room was reliving its past, its walls whispering the tales of horror and suffering. I can't stay here," Meredith murmured, her face pale. The energy it quote s too much. I nodded, my own heart hammering in my chest. The room was a vortex of negative energy, its aura of dread almost suffocating. As we turned to leave, a soft whisper echoed through the room. It was a plea, a cry for mercy from the depths of despair. The whisper grew louder, filling the room with a chilling symphony of pain and suffering. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, the chilling touch sending shivers down my spine. "We're not alone," Paul whispered, his voice barely audible. I could feel it too, the unseen presence lurking in the shadows. The room was alive, its inhabitants unseen but undeniably present. The walls seemed to close in around us, their cold stone surfaces pulsing with the heartbeats of the souls trapped within. Let's get out of here," Meredith stuttered, her voice trembling. Paul, despite his fascination with the supernatural, was quick to agree. His device, still beeping wildly, was a stark reminder of the unseen presence around us. The door, however, refused to budge. No matter how hard we pushed, it stood firm, as if held shut by some unseen force. Panic started to seep in, a cold, clawing fear that gripped our hearts. We were trapped, locked within the room that was a living testament to the horrors of the past. The walls seemed to close in around us, their cold stone surfaces pulsing with an unseen energy. Then, as suddenly as it had slammed shut, the door swung open. We stumbled out, our hearts pounding, the taste of fear fresh on our tongues. The corridor outside was a welcome relief, its air free of the oppressive dread that had filled the room. As we caught our breaths, I couldn't help but look back at the room. It was a portal into the past, a mirror reflecting the horrors that had taken place within the prison walls. The room had shared its secrets, its walls breaking their centuries-long silence to reveal the tales of horror and suffering. That night, as we huddled together in the relative safety of the prison's entrance hall, I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The prison was a living entity, its walls whispering the tales of horror and despair. It was a tomb of stories, each one darker than the last.